Now to Mr. Wright from the International Livestock Research Institute. He's stepping in at the last minute for Jimmy Smith, the Director General, who had to leave. He was with us earlier in the morning. Can you give us a perspective from your experience in livestock research, please?
Thank you.
They manage the microphone. Don't touch the microphone.
Thank you very much. Is it on? So, if you look at the world today of 7.5 billion people, only about 1/3 is adequately fed and adequately nourished. We have 20% people who are obese. We have 20% of the population with insufficient nutrients. We have over 800 million people hungry, and over 150 million children who are stunted. So how did we get here?
Maybe get closer to the microphone, please.
So how did we get to this position? Well, we know that for decades we focused very much in terms of agricultural production and development of just producing more calories. And then we began to think about protein. But now we realize that the situation is much more complex. It's not just about protein, it's about essential amino acids, it's about vitamins, minerals, and so on. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to do many things, some of which we've already heard this afternoon, and we'll hear more over the course of the next 2 days. But one of the things I think we need to do is pay more attention to animal-sourced foods, including fish. And why do I say that? Because milk, meat, eggs, and fish provide key nutrients such as vitamins A, B12, choline, iron, zinc, and so on, in quantities and in bioavailable forms that are more available than in many plant-based diets. And we have to remember that eggs and milk are amongst nature's first foods. And we now have evidence that animal-sourced foods are critical at certain stages of development, in particular the first 1,000 days of life. So what do we need to do? Well, I would argue we need to invest more in animal and fish agriculture. Why do I say that? If you look at total overseas development assistance, while agriculture accounted for 15% a couple of decades ago, now agriculture only represents about 4.5% of ODA. And of that 4.5%, livestock accounts for 5%. And if you look at the investment by many national governments, the figures would not be all that different. Livestock rarely gets more than 5% of agricultural investment, despite the fact that livestock account for 40% of agricultural GDP, including in developing countries. And livestock commodities account for 5 of the top 10 agricultural commodities by value globally. So invest more in livestock. What else do we need to do? Well, we need to end what I would call the hysteria from many parts of the developed world about the consumption of animal-sourced foods. It might be appropriate in North America, where meat consumption is over 100 kilograms per capita per year. Might be appropriate indeed in Europe, where consumption is around 70 kilograms per year. But it's not appropriate in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, where meat consumption is only 8 kilograms per capita per year, to call for reductions in consumption of animal-sourced foods. And in fact, we know that even a small increase in the intake of animal-sourced foods could have a huge impact on nutrition, the health, and the development of many millions of people in developing countries who are consuming very low quantities, very small quantities of animal-sourced foods. And while undoubtedly livestock can have negative impacts on the environment, they can also have positive impacts. But even those negative impacts, we're not entirely clear of their magnitude, because most of the information that we have, for example, on greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, come from OECD countries, North America, Europe, Australasia. We know that the emission coefficients in the developing countries are much lower than those in developed countries, but we have very little data. We are now starting to produce the very first data, for example, on greenhouse gas emissions from livestock systems in Africa. And they confirm that the emissions are much lower than from North America or Europe, for example. So my point is that livestock and fish are a critical part of accelerating the end of hunger and malnutrition.